I am Rachel Miller, 36 years old, a former Army nurse, a survivor who crawled back from 8 years of oblivion in Afghanistan, returning with calloused hands and a heart stitched together by scars that would never fully heal. At the memorial service for my husband, Senator Jonathan Miller, the scent of white lilies hung thick and suffocating in the grand hall. Camera flashes erupted like silent lightning, and the whispers of journalists buzzed like a shattered hive. All I wanted was to see my 4 children, the quadruplets I had given birth to during those lost years, to hold them close and tell them that their mother had never stopped fighting to come home. But then Lady Catherine Doyle emerged from the sea of black-clad mourners, her gown sweeping the marble floor like a queen's train, her voice cutting through the air like steel on glass. "You are nothing but a worthless substitute, a ghost from the past with no right to call yourself a mother." The packed hall fell into a silence so deep it felt like the earth itself had stopped breathing. And in that frozen moment, Margaret Miller, my mother-in-law, the woman who had once despised me, who had called me unworthy, suddenly stepped forward and slapped Catherine across the face, a sound that echoed like thunder against the vaulted ceiling. She roared, "Don't you ever dare disrespect a mother." Applause erupted, wild and deafening, but in my chest, I knew. This was only the opening drumbeat of a war that would consume us all. The story didn't begin in that hall. It began years ago, in a small, forgotten town in Ohio, where I grew up in a trailer park with rusted fences and broken streetlights. My mother left when I was 6. My father drank himself into oblivion by the time I was 12, and I learned early that survival meant never asking for help, never showing weakness, never expecting anyone to catch you when you fell. I swore an oath to myself under those dim, flickering lights. I would never let my children grow up feeling abandoned the way I did. I joined the Army at 18, became a combat medic, and was deployed to Afghanistan at 23. It was there, in the dust and blood and chaos of a war zone, that I met Jonathan Miller. He was a young military advisor then, not yet a senator, not yet the man whose name would be whispered in the halls of power. He was just a man who looked at me with eyes that saw past the uniform, past the exhaustion, past the walls I had built around myself. I saved his life 3 times. Once when a mortar round shattered the convoy he was in, once when he took shrapnel to the chest during an ambush, and once when infection nearly claimed him in a field hospital with no supplies and no hope. He told me later, when we were married, that he had fallen in love with me the moment I pulled him from the wreckage, my hands covered in his blood, my voice steady, even as the world burned around us. "You didn't just save my life, Rachel," he said. "You gave me a reason to live." But love, I learned, is never simple when power is involved. Jonathan came from a family steeped in politics, money, and influence. The National Council, a shadowy coalition of old money elites, military contractors, and political dynasties, had groomed him from birth to be their golden boy, their puppet in the Senate. And they had already chosen his bride, Catherine Doyle, daughter of a steel magnate, educated at Yale, connected to every senator and lobbyist who mattered. She was everything I was not. Polished, poised, untouchable. When Jonathan announced our engagement, the council moved swiftly to crush it. They planted stories in the press, leaked fabricated rumors about my past, pressured his family to intervene. Margaret Miller, his mother, summoned me to her estate in Virginia and told me bluntly, "You are not good enough for my son. You come from nothing. You will drag him down." I remember standing in her pristine living room, surrounded by portraits of ancestors who had signed the Declaration of Independence, and feeling like an intruder in a world I would never belong to. But Jonathan defied them all. He married me in a small ceremony on a military base, with no media, no cameras, no council approval. For a brief, fragile moment, I believed we had won. Then came the helicopter crash. It happened on a routine supply run in Kandahar. I was returning from a forward operating base when the engine failed, and the aircraft plummeted into a ravine. I woke up 3 days later in a rebel-controlled village with no memory of who I was, no identification, no way to contact anyone. For 8 years, I lived in the mountains, working as a healer for villagers who had no access to hospitals, hiding from Taliban patrols, struggling to piece together fragments of a life I couldn't remember. I didn't know I had been pregnant. I didn't know I had given birth to 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, until a humanitarian aid worker found me and showed me a photograph of the quadruplets who had been born in a U.S. military hospital, listed as orphans because their mother had been declared dead. When I finally returned to American soil, disheveled and disoriented, I expected to be welcomed home. Instead, I found that Jonathan had died 6 months earlier in a car accident that the official report called mechanical failure, but that whispers in the capital suggested was something far more sinister. I found that my children had been placed under the guardianship of Margaret Miller, who had never acknowledged them as her grandchildren until Jonathan's death made them politically valuable. And I found that Catherine Doyle had positioned herself as the grieving almost widow, the woman who should have been Jonathan's wife, the woman who now claimed the right to guide his legacy. The council had moved quickly to erase me. My military records were sealed. My medical history was redacted. Even the birth certificates of my children listed me only as unknown mother. It was as if I had never existed. But I had survived 8 years in a war zone. I had delivered my own children in a cave with no medical supplies. I had stitched wounds with thread pulled from my own clothing and fought off armed men with nothing but a scalpel and the will to live. I had not come back from the dead to be erased. The memorial service was supposed to be a private family affair, but Catherine had turned it into a spectacle, a media circus designed to cement her narrative, that Jonathan had been a tragic hero, that his wife had been a forgotten casualty of war, and that his children deserved a proper mother, meaning her. The hall was filled with senators, lobbyists, journalists, and council members, all of them watching, all of them waiting to see if I would crumble under the weight of their scrutiny. When Catherine spoke those words, "You are nothing but a worthless substitute," I felt the old Rachel, the one who had learned to survive by staying silent, rise up inside me. But then I looked at my children, standing in a row near the front of the hall, their faces pale and confused, and I remembered the oath I had made in that trailer park so many years ago. I would not be silent, not this time. Margaret's slap was not just a defense of me, it was a declaration. She had spent the past 6 months watching Catherine manipulate the council, watching her poison the press against me, watching her try to take custody of the children. And Margaret, for all her faults, was a mother first. She had lost her son. She would not lose her grandchildren to a woman who saw them as nothing more than political assets. As the applause faded and the camera zoomed in, Catherine's face twisted into something cold and venomous. She straightened her dress, smoothed her hair, and said loud enough for every microphone to catch, "This changes nothing. The National Council will convene a hearing to determine Rachel Miller's fitness as a mother. And when they do, the truth will come out. She is mentally unstable, emotionally unfit, and legally unqualified to raise children." The council had already begun its work. Within hours of the memorial service, the headlines shifted. War trauma survivor deemed unfit for custody. Former nurse's 8-year disappearance raises questions about mental health. National Council to investigate senator's widow. Every major news outlet ran stories questioning my sanity, my credibility, my right to exist. Social media exploded with hashtags both supporting and condemning me. Half the country saw me as a hero who had survived the unimaginable. The other half saw me as a liability, a woman too broken to be trusted. I sat in Margaret's estate that night, staring at the news coverage on a dozen screens, my children asleep upstairs, and felt the weight of the world pressing down on my chest. I had fought so hard to come home. I had endured so much to stay alive. And now, the people who should have been protecting me were trying to destroy me. But as I sat there, surrounded by the opulence of a world I had never belonged to, I felt something shift inside me. It was not anger. It was not despair. It was clarity. The council thought they could erase me because I was nobody, a woman from a trailer park, a soldier with PTSD, a mother with no legal standing, but they had forgotten something crucial. I had survived Afghanistan. I had survived 8 years of hell, and I would survive them too. That night, I made a decision. I would not beg. I would not plead. I would not ask for their mercy. I would fight, not with their weapons, not with their rules, but with the one thing they could never take from me, the truth. And the truth was simple. I was Rachel Miller. I was a mother. And no one, not the council, not Catherine, not even the United States government, had the right to take that away from me. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later in Washington, D.C., in a cold, marble-clad chamber that had once been used for Senate subcommittee meetings, but now served as the National Council's private court. The official title was Fitness Determination, Hearing for Custody of the Miller Quadruplets, but everyone knew what it really was, a public execution disguised as due process. I arrived at Margaret's estate the morning after the memorial service to find her sitting in her study, a glass of bourbon in one hand and a folder of legal documents in the other. She looked older than I remembered, her hair more silver, her eyes hollowed by grief. When she saw me, she didn't apologize for the years of coldness, for the cruelty she had shown me when Jonathan first brought me home. She simply said, "They're going to tear you apart, Rachel. But if you let them, Jonathan died for nothing." I sat across from her, my hands folded in my lap, and asked, "Why did you defend me?" She looked at me for a long moment, then said, "Because I was wrong about you. I thought you were weak. I thought you would break. But you came back from the dead and you didn't beg for anyone's pity. You just stood there, waiting for the world to remember who you are." She paused, took a sip of bourbon, and added, "That's exactly what Jonathan would have done." For the first time since I had returned, I felt something that resembled hope. Margaret was not my ally because she loved me. She was my ally because she understood that the council had taken her son from her, and she would not let them take his children too. Over the next 3 weeks, I prepared for the hearing with the intensity of someone preparing for war. Margaret hired a team of lawyers, not the corporate types who represented the council, but civil rights attorneys, veterans advocates, and family law specialists who had spent their careers fighting for the powerless. The lead attorney was a woman named Elena Vasquez, a former prosecutor who had left the district attorney's office after watching too many cases get buried by political pressure. She was sharp, relentless, and unafraid of the council's power. Elena sat me down in Margaret's library and said, "Rachel, they're going to come after every part of your life, your mental health, your memory loss, the fact that you gave birth in a war zone without medical supervision. They're going to paint you as unstable, as a danger to your own children. And the worst part is, they don't need to prove anything. This isn't a real court. The council operates outside the legal system. They only need to create enough doubt to justify taking custody." I looked at her and said, "Then we don't let them create doubt. We give them the truth." Elena smiled for the first time. "Good. Then let's start building your defense." The first piece of evidence came from Captain James Holloway, a retired Army officer who had served with me in Afghanistan. He had been in the convoy the day of the helicopter crash and had spent years trying to find out what happened to me. When he learned I was alive, he reached out immediately, bringing with him something I had thought was lost forever: my combat journal, a leather-bound notebook I had kept throughout my deployment. Inside were detailed accounts of every mission, every patient I treated, every moment I had spent with Jonathan. It was proof, undeniable, handwritten proof, that I had not only been a capable soldier, but had saved lives, including Jonathan's, multiple times. Elena read through the journal with tears in her eyes. "This is your story, Rachel. This is who you are. And when the council tries to paint you as broken, we're going to show them exactly how strong you've always been." The second piece of evidence came from Dr. Amina Khatri, the humanitarian worker who had found me in the mountains. She had kept meticulous records of my condition when she first encountered me: medical evaluations, psychological assessments, witness statements from villagers who had relied on me for care. She testified in a sworn affidavit that despite my memory loss, I had exhibited exceptional cognitive function, emotional resilience, and maternal instinct throughout the years I spent in hiding. She wrote, "Rachel Miller is not a victim of war. She is a survivor, and the children she gave birth to, under conditions that would have broken most people, are proof of her extraordinary strength." But the most powerful piece of evidence came from my children themselves. One evening, as I sat in the estate's garden, trying to process the weight of everything that was coming, my oldest son, Ethan, approached me. He was 10 years old, tall for his age, with Jonathan's dark hair and my green eyes. He sat down beside me without saying anything, and for a long time, we just watched the sun set over the Virginia hills. Then he said quietly, "Mom, are they going to take us away from you?" I didn't lie to him. "They're going to try." He nodded, his jaw tightening in that way children do when they're trying not to cry. "Then we need to stop them." I looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" He pulled something from his backpack, a small key, tarnished with age. "This is the key to Dad's office. He gave it to me before he died and told me to use it if I ever needed to find the truth." My heart skipped. What truth? Ethan looked at me with the kind of determination I had only seen in soldiers. "The truth about why he married you. The truth about why the council wanted him to marry Catherine. The truth about what really happened to him." That night, Ethan, his siblings, Ella, Noah, and Lily, and I broke into Jonathan's old Senate office, now sealed and under council control. The children knew the security codes: Jonathan's birthday, my birthday, the day we were married. Inside, we found filing cabinets filled with documents, letters from the council pressuring Jonathan to end our marriage, financial records showing bribes paid to silence journalists, and most damning of all, a contract, signed by Catherine and several council members, that laid out a plan to neutralize Rachel Miller as a political liability in the event of Jonathan's death. Elena nearly wept when she saw it. "This is conspiracy. This is fraud. This is everything we need." But I knew it wouldn't be enough. The council controlled the media. They controlled the narrative, and they controlled the hearing. We needed something more, something that would force the entire country to see the truth. That's when Margaret made a decision that changed everything. She called a press conference, invited every major news outlet, and stood in front of the cameras with me by her side. She looked directly into the lens and said, "My name is Margaret Miller. I am the mother of Senator Jonathan Miller, and I am here to tell you that the National Council is lying. They tried to control my son. They tried to erase his wife, and now they are trying to steal his children. This is not about fitness. This is about power, and I will not let them win." The press conference went viral within hours. Social media exploded with support. Stand with Rachel began trending worldwide. Protests erupted outside the Capitol, with mothers, veterans, and ordinary citizens holding signs that read, "Don't take our mothers," and "Rachel Miller is a hero." But Catherine Doyle was not finished. 2 days before the hearing, she held her own press conference, flanked by council members and sympathetic senators. She looked into the camera with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "Rachel Miller is not a villain. She is a victim. But being a victim does not make you fit to raise children. The council has evidence, medical records, psychological evaluations, witness testimony, that will prove she is a danger to herself and others. And when this hearing is over, those children will finally be safe." The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the past 8 years. I thought about the villagers who had sheltered me, the children I had delivered in caves, the nights I had spent wondering if I would ever see my own children again. I thought about Jonathan, about the way he had looked at me the last time I saw him, about the promise he had made to protect me no matter what. And I thought about my own mother, the woman who had left me when I was 6, the woman I had spent my life trying not to become. I whispered into the darkness, "I won't let them take my children. I won't let them erase me. Not again." The next morning, as I dressed in a simple black suit, Margaret knocked on my door. She handed me something wrapped in tissue paper. Inside was a locket, the same locket Jonathan had given me on our wedding day, the one I thought I had lost in the crash. She said, "He wanted you to have this. He wanted you to remember that no matter what they say, no matter what they do, you are his wife, and you are their mother. Nothing can change that." I put the locket around my neck, took a deep breath, and walked out the door. The hearing was about to begin, and I was ready. The hearing chamber was a cathedral of cold marble and judgmental silence. High ceilings soared above rows of wooden benches packed with journalists, council members, senators, and spectators who had lined up for hours just to witness what the media was already calling the trial of the century. At the front of the room sat 7 council members, their faces impassive, their robes black as mourning cloth. In the center was Judge Leonard Ashford, a man whose family had sat on the council for 4 generations, a man who had presided over countless cases where power crushed justice and no one dared to object. I sat at a small table with Elena beside me, Margaret directly behind us, and my 4 children in the front row of the gallery, flanked by security guards who made sure they couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but watch. Across the aisle sat Catherine Doyle, dressed in white, a calculated choice, a costume meant to evoke purity and virtue, and surrounded by a team of lawyers whose combined billable hours could have funded a small country. Judge Ashford banged his gavel, and the room fell silent. He looked down at me with the kind of disdain reserved for people who dare to challenge the natural order of things and said, "Mrs. Miller, you are here today because the National Council has raised concerns about your ability to provide a safe and stable environment for your children. This hearing will determine whether you retain custody or whether guardianship will be transferred to a more suitable party." Elena stood. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is not a custody hearing. This is a witch hunt. The council has no legal authority to strip a mother of her children based on conjecture and prejudice." Ashford's eyes narrowed. "Counselor, you will speak when spoken to. Mrs. Miller, do you understand the charges against you?" I stood slowly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I understand that you're trying to take my children because I'm inconvenient. I understand that you want to rewrite history so that Jonathan's legacy belongs to someone more controllable. And I understand that you think I'm too broken, too traumatized, too poor to fight back. I paused, letting the silence stretch. But you're wrong. A ripple of whispers moved through the gallery. Ashford's face reddened. Mrs. Miller, you will refrain from... Elena cut him off. Your Honor, if the counsel wishes to question Mrs. Miller's fitness, then let them present their evidence, and let us present ours. Catherine's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Reginald Thorne, stood with the practiced ease of someone who had never lost a case. Your Honor, the evidence is clear. Mrs. Miller disappeared for 8 years. She has no memory of that time. She gave birth without medical supervision in a hostile environment. She suffers from PTSD, depression, and dissociative amnesia. And she has no stable income, no permanent residence, and no support system outside of Mrs. Margaret Miller, who herself has a history of controlling behavior. He placed a stack of documents on the judge's bench: medical records, psychiatric evaluations, testimonies from doctors who had never met me but were willing to speculate about my mental state based on the counsel's narrative. He turned to the gallery and said, Ladies and gentlemen, we are not here to vilify Rachel Miller. We are here to protect 4 innocent children from a mother who, through no fault of her own, is simply not capable of caring for them. It was a masterful performance, compassionate, reasonable, impossible to argue against. The journalists scribbled furiously. The council members nodded approvingly, and for a moment I felt the old fear rising up inside me, the fear that no matter how hard I fought, the system would always win. But then Elena stood, and her voice was a blade cutting through the noise. Your Honor, I would like to call Captain James Holloway to the stand. Captain Holloway entered the chamber in full dress uniform, his medals gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He took the stand, was sworn in, and looked directly at me with the kind of respect soldiers reserve for those who have saved their lives. Elena asked, Captain, how do you know Rachel Miller? He spoke clearly, his voice filling the room. I served with her in Afghanistan. She was a combat medic attached to our unit. She saved my life twice, once during an IED attack and once when I contracted sepsis in the field. She was one of the most skilled, level-headed, courageous medics I've ever worked with. Elena handed him the journal. Captain, is this Rachel Miller's combat journal? He examined it, nodded. Yes, ma'am. She kept detailed records of every mission, every patient. I recognize her handwriting. Elena turned to the counsel. Your Honor, this journal contains first-hand accounts of Rachel Miller's actions in a war zone. It proves she was not only capable of functioning under extreme stress, but excelled at it. It also proves she saved Senator Jonathan Miller's life on 3 separate occasions. Thorne shot to his feet. Objection. This journal is hearsay. It has no bearing on her current mental state. Elena didn't miss a beat. Then let's talk about her current mental state. She called Dr. Amina Khatri to the stand. Dr. Khatri, a small woman with fierce eyes and a British accent sharpened by years of working in conflict zones, testified about finding me in the mountains. She described how I had been caring for villagers, delivering babies, treating injuries, all while living under constant threat from Taliban patrols. She said, Rachel Miller did not break. She adapted. She survived. And she did so while raising 4 children in conditions that would have killed most people. If that is not fitness, then I don't know what is. Thorne stood again. Dr. Khatri, you are not a licensed psychiatrist in the United States. Your opinion is irrelevant. But Dr. Khatri looked at him with the kind of calm that comes from having stared down warlords and said, Mr. Thorne, I have worked in 18 countries, treated over 10,000 patients, and seen more trauma than you could imagine. And I can tell you this. Rachel Miller is not broken. She is one of the strongest people I have ever met." The gallery erupted in applause. Judge Ashford banged his gavel furiously, shouting for order, but the damage was done. The narrative was shifting. And then came the moment that changed everything. Elena called Ethan Miller to the stand. A gasp rippled through the room. Children were not typically allowed to testify in counsel hearings, but Elena had argued that under the Family Protection Act, minors had the right to speak in custody cases. Ashford tried to overrule it, but Margaret stood and said loudly, "If you silence my grandson, you prove everything Rachel has said about this council." Ethan walked to the stand, his small frame dwarfed by the towering bench, but his eyes were steady. Elena asked gently, "Ethan, do you love your mother?" He looked at me, and his voice was clear. "Yes." "Has she ever hurt you?" "No." "Do you feel safe with her?" "Yes." Elena nodded. "Ethan, I know this is hard, but can you tell the council what you found in your father's office?" Ethan reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. He handed it to Elena, who unfolded it and held it up for everyone to see. "Your Honor, this is a contract signed by Catherine Doyle and several council members. It outlines a plan to remove Rachel Miller as a political obstacle following Senator Miller's death. It includes financial incentives, media strategies, and legal mechanisms to strip her of custody." The room exploded. Journalists shouted questions. Council members stood, demanding the document be sealed. Catherine's face went white. Judge Ashford hammered his gavel, but the chaos was unstoppable. Elena raised her voice above the din. "This is not a custody hearing. This is a conspiracy, and the National Council is complicit." Thorne tried to recover. "Your Honor, that document is out of context. It was a contingency plan in the event that Mrs. Miller was deemed unfit." "By whom?" Elena demanded. "Who gets to decide a mother is unfit? You? The council? A woman who wanted to steal her husband?" Catherine stood, trembling with rage. "I loved Jonathan. I would have been a better wife, a better mother." "You never even met my children," I shouted, standing for the first time without permission. "You didn't care about Jonathan. You cared about his name, his power, his legacy. But those children are not his legacy. They are mine. I carried them. I gave birth to them in a cave with no doctor, no painkillers, nothing but the will to survive. And you want to take them because you think I'm not good enough?" Judge Ashford slammed his gavel. "Mrs. Miller, sit down, or I will hold you in contempt." But I didn't sit. I looked at the council, at Catherine, at the cameras broadcasting this to the entire country, and I said, "I am Rachel Miller. I survived 8 years in a war zone. I survived losing my memory. I survived giving birth alone. I survived being erased. And I will not let you erase my children." And then, from the gallery, a voice rang out. "Mom!" It was Ella, my daughter, standing with her siblings. Noah and Lily stood beside her, their small hands clutching signs they had made that morning. The signs read, "Our mom is a hero, and don't take our family." Security moved to restrain them, but Margaret stepped in front of them, arms spread wide. "Touch them, and you'll answer to me." The guards hesitated. The cameras zoomed in. And then, one by one, people in the gallery began to stand. Veterans, mothers, ordinary citizens who had been watching the hearing unfold. They stood in silence, a wall of bodies between the council and my children. Judge Ashford looked around, his face pale, his authority crumbling. He whispered something to the other council members, and after a tense, whispered conversation, he banged his gavel one final time. "This hearing is adjourned. The council will reconvene in 3 days to issue a final ruling." But as we left the chamber, surrounded by a sea of supporters. I knew the truth. We had already won. Not because the council had changed their minds, but because the entire country had seen them for what they were, a corrupt system built on erasing inconvenient truths. And I was no longer an inconvenient truth. I was a symbol of something far more powerful, the refusal to be silenced. 3 days later, the council issued their ruling. Under immense public pressure, under the threat of federal investigations, under the weight of protests that had shut down streets in every major city, they ruled in my favor. Custody was restored. Catherine Doyle was barred from any further contact with my children, and several council members quietly resigned. But the victory was not without cost. Margaret, exhausted by the fight, suffered a stroke the night after the ruling. She survived, but she was never quite the same. In her hospital bed, she held my hand and whispered, "I'm sorry I didn't see you sooner, Rachel. You were always strong enough." I stayed by her side as she recovered, and we became something I never thought possible. Family. Not because of blood, but because we had fought for the same thing, the right to protect the people we loved. 6 months later, I stood in a small church in Virginia, surrounded by my children, Margaret, Elena, Dr. Khatri, and Captain Holloway. It was not a grand affair. No media, no politicians, no spectacle. It was just us, the people who had fought beside me, the people who had never stopped believing. Margaret had insisted on organizing a ceremony, not a wedding, because Jonathan was gone, but a reaffirmation of identity, a public declaration that I was reclaiming the name, the life, and the family that had been stolen from me. She stood at the front of the church and said, "Rachel Miller is not a survivor. She is a warrior. And today, we honor her not for what she endured, but for who she chose to be in spite of it." I looked at my children, at their faces glowing with pride, and I realized something I had never allowed myself to believe. I was enough. Not because I was perfect, not because I had never broken, but because I had survived every attempt to erase me and still chose to love, to fight, to believe in something better. As we left the church, a reporter approached and asked, "Mrs. Miller, what would you say to other mothers who feel invisible, who feel like the world has forgotten them?" I looked directly into the camera and said, "You are not invisible. You are not forgotten. And no one, not the government, not the powerful, not anyone, has the right to take away what makes you a mother. Stand up, fight back, and never, ever let them convince you that you don't matter." The reporter pressed, "And what about Catherine Doyle? Do you forgive her?" I thought about it for a moment, then said, "Forgiveness is not the same as surrender. I don't need to forgive her to move on. I just need to remember that I won." As we drove away, Ethan asked from the back seat, "Mom, what happens now?" I smiled, looked at him in the rearview mirror, and said, "Now? Now we live. If you've made it this far, thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing that my story mattered. But more than that, thank you for recognizing that this story is not just mine. It's the story of every woman who has been told she is not enough, every mother who has been pushed aside, every survivor who has been erased." I want to ask you something. Have you ever been made to feel invisible? Have you ever fought for something only to be told you didn't deserve it? Have you ever been silenced, dismissed, or erased by people who thought they had the right to decide your worth? If the answer is yes, then I need you to do something for me. I need you to share your story, not because the world deserves to hear it, but because you deserve to speak it. Because silence is what they want. Silence is how they win. This channel, Grandma True Stories, exists to give voice to the women who have been forgotten, The mothers who have been dismissed, the survivors who have been told to sit down and be quiet. We tell the stories that make the powerful uncomfortable. We tell the stories that remind the world that mothers are not invisible. So if this story moved you, if it made you angry, if it made you cry, if it made you believe that justice is still possible, subscribe. Share this video. Tell someone who needs to hear it. And if you have your own story, leave it in the comments, because every story matters. Every voice matters. You matter. The council tried to erase me. They failed. And if they come for you, I promise you this: you will not stand alone. Thank you for listening. Thank you for fighting. And thank you for remembering that no matter what they take from us, they can never take away the truth of who we are. We are mothers. We are warriors. And we will never be silent again.